Dr. Sarah Thompson stood at gate A7 of the busy Atlanta International Airport, her Louis Vuitton carry-on bag placed neatly beside her polished black heels. The warm June morning sun streamed through the large terminal windows, highlighting her perfectly pressed navy blue business suit. At 35, she had grown used to being one of the few black women in her position as a leading cardiothoracic surgeon, but what she never got used to was the occasional reminder that some people still couldn't see past the color of her skin. Boarding for Flight 2471 to Chicago will now begin with our first-class passengers, announced the gate agent, her voice crisp and professional over the intercom. Sarah gathered her belongings and moved toward the priority boarding line, ticket and ID in hand. She had an important medical conference to attend, where she would be presenting her groundbreaking research on minimally invasive heart surgery techniques. As she approached the gate, she noticed Captain James Werner, a middle-aged white man with graying temples, observing the boarding process. The line moved quickly, and soon it was Sarah's turn. Just as she was about to hand her boarding pass to the gate agent, Captain Werner stepped forward, holding up his hand. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a tone that Sarah had heard too many times before. "I believe you might be in the wrong line. This is for first-class passengers only." Sarah maintained her professional composure, something she had mastered over years of dealing with similar situations. "Yes, I'm aware. I have a first-class ticket." She held out her boarding pass for him to see. Captain Werner barely glanced at the ticket. "There must be some mistake. These tickets are quite expensive, and I need to ensure everyone is in their proper place." Several other passengers in line began to notice the exchange. A young woman a few feet away started recording with her phone, while others whispered among themselves. "There's no mistake," Sarah replied calmly, though her heart was racing. "I'm Dr. Sarah Thompson, and I'm booked in seat 2A. You're welcome to verify this with the gate agent." The gate agent, a young woman named Jenny, looked uncomfortable as she checked the computer. "Captain Werner, Dr. Thompson's ticket is indeed for first class, seat 2A. Everything is in order." But Werner wasn't finished. He crossed his arms and stood straighter, using his height to look down at Sarah. "We have certain standards in first class. I'm sure you understand. Perhaps we should double-check your credentials." A small crowd had gathered now, with some passengers expressing their disapproval through loud sighs and concerned looks. Sarah felt her cheeks grow warm, not from embarrassment, but from the familiar feeling of controlled anger. "My credentials?" Sarah's voice remained steady. "Captain Werner, are you asking all passengers for their credentials, or just me?" "Now, don't make this into something it's not," Werner said, his face reddening slightly. "I'm simply trying to maintain order and ensure everyone is where they belong." Sarah looked around the gate area, noting several other first-class passengers who had boarded without question, none of whom were black. She reached into her bag and pulled out her medical license and hospital ID, even though she knew she shouldn't have to. "Since you're so concerned about my credentials, Captain Werner, here they are. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon headed to Chicago to present at the National Medical Conference. I booked and paid for my first-class ticket, just like everyone else." Werner's face twitched with discomfort, but he didn't back down. "Well, regulations require me to ensure." "What regulations exactly?" A deep voice interrupted from behind Sarah. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Her husband, Colonel Marcus Thompson, had returned from his quick trip to the restroom. She could hear in his voice that controlled fury she knew so well, the same tone he used in the courtroom when he was about to make someone regret their choices. The atmosphere at Gate A7 shifted instantly. Other passengers watched intently as Marcus, dressed in his crisp military uniform displaying his colonel's insignia, stepped forward to stand beside his wife. At 6'2", he cut an imposing figure, but it was his calm, authoritative presence that made Captain Werner take an unconscious step back. Little did Captain Werner know that his discriminatory actions that morning would not only cost him his job, would also trigger a chain of events that would change airline policies across the country. But for now, he stood there, about to face the consequences of choosing the wrong passenger to discriminate against on the wrong day. Colonel Marcus Thompson took one look at his wife's tense shoulders and the rapidly gathering crowd before addressing Captain Werner in a measured tone that came from years of military and legal experience. "I believe I asked you a question, Captain. Which specific regulations are you following?" Marcus's voice was calm but firm as he pulled out his phone and began recording. Captain Werner shifted uncomfortably, his previous confidence wavering under the colonel's steady gaze. I have the authority to verify passenger credentials when necessary. When necessary? Marcus raised an eyebrow. And what made it necessary in this particular case? He gestured toward the other first-class passengers who had already boarded, none of whom had been questioned. The gate agent, Jenny, nervously looked between her computer screen and the unfolding situation. More passengers had their phones out now, recording the incident. A young mother covered her child's ears, sensing the tension in the air. "Look," Werner said, his face now visibly red. "I'm just doing my job. We've had incidents of people trying to sneak into first class before." "Interesting," Marcus replied, his legal training kicking in. "Jenny, could you please pull up the passenger manifest? I'd like to know how many other first-class passengers Captain Werner questioned today." Jenny's fingers trembled slightly as she typed. "Sir, according to our records, Dr. Thompson is the only passenger who was asked to provide additional credentials." A murmur rippled through the crowd. An elderly white gentleman in a business suit stepped forward from the first-class line. "This is ridiculous. I boarded just minutes ago, and the captain didn't ask me for anything." Werner's face grew even redder. That's different. I just had a feeling that." "A feeling?" Marcus interrupted, his voice growing harder. "Please, Captain Werner, explain what kind of feeling made you single out my wife, a distinguished surgeon, for this special treatment?" Sarah placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. "Marcus," she said softly, though her own anger was evident in her eyes, "let's not make a scene." "Oh, we're well past that point, honey," Marcus replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But you're right. This isn't about making a scene. This is about accountability." He turned to address the growing crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're all witnesses here today. What you're seeing is not just an isolated incident but a pattern of behavior that needs to be addressed." Werner tried to regain control of the situation. "Now see here, you're disrupting the boarding process. I could have you removed from the flight." A sharp laugh came from somewhere in the crowd. Someone shouted, "For what?" Defending his wife against discrimination. Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Please do try to remove us, Captain. As a military GAG officer specializing in discrimination cases, I would be very interested in the legal justification for that action." The mention of his legal background caused Werner to pale visibly. Several passengers applauded, and more phones came out to record the exchange. An airline supervisor, attracted by the commotion, hurried over to gate S7. Mrs. Patricia Chen, her name tag identifying her as the terminal operations manager, quickly assessed the situation. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, looking between the parties involved. Before Werner could speak, Marcus played the video he'd recorded on his phone. The footage clearly showed Werner's discriminatory behavior and his weak attempts at justification. Mrs. Chen's expression grew increasingly concerned as she watched. When the video ended, she turned to the Thompsons. "Dr. and Colonel Thompson, on behalf of the airline, I sincerely apologize for this unacceptable treatment." She then turned to Captain Werner, her voice sharp. "Captain, please report to my office immediately. We'll need to discuss this incident in detail." Werner opened his mouth to protest but seemed to think better of it. He turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Mrs. Chen looked back at the Thompsons. "We'll be launching a full investigation into this incident, and Captain Werner will not be operating this flight today." The crowd broke into applause again, but Sarah and Marcus weren't celebrating. They knew this was just the beginning. As Mrs. Chen arranged for another pilot to take over the flight, Sarah squeezed her husband's hand, grateful for his presence but saddened that such incidents still occurred in 2024. Little did Captain Werner know that his career wasn't the only thing about to change. The entire airline industry was about to get a wake-up call. The news of the incident at Gate S7 spread through Atlanta International Airport like wildfire. Within 30 minutes, Mrs. Chen had called an emergency meeting in the airline's terminal office, where Sarah and Marcus Thompson sat across from 3 airline executives who had rushed down from their corporate offices. "Dr. and Colonel Thompson," began Mr. Richard Hayes, the airline's regional director, I want to personally assure you that we take this matter extremely seriously. He straightened his tie nervously as he glanced at the social media updates on his phone. The video of the incident was already going viral. Sarah sat perfectly straight in her chair, her doctor's coat now draped over her arm. With all due respect, Mr. Hayes, we've heard these assurances before. What we want to know is what concrete actions you plan to take. Marcus nodded, his military bearing unchanged despite the 2 hours that had passed since the confrontation. I've already received calls from 3 major news networks and 2 civil rights organizations. But we're not interested in publicity. We want change. In the corner of the office, Captain Werner sat with the airline's union representative. He had changed out of his pilot's uniform into civilian clothes, looking much smaller than he had earlier at the gate. The arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by a mix of fear and resignation. Captain Werner, Marcus said, turning to face him directly, would you like to explain yourself now? Werner shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I want to apologize. I didn't mean to. To what? Sarah interrupted, her voice firm but controlled. To assume I couldn't afford a first-class ticket, to humiliate me in front of other passengers, to demonstrate your prejudice so clearly that dozens of people felt compelled to record it. The room fell silent. Even the union representative looked uncomfortable. We have records, Mrs. Chen said, breaking the tension as she placed a folder on the table, of 2 previous complaints against Captain Werner for similar incidents. They were handled internally. She looked ashamed at this admission. Marcus leaned forward. Handled internally? You mean buried? He opened his briefcase and pulled out his laptop. While we've been sitting here, my office has been busy. We found 6 more incidents across 3 airlines where Captain Werner worked previously, all involving passengers of color, all handled internally. Werner's face went pale. The union representative whispered something in his ear, but he shook his head. No more excuses, Werner said suddenly, his voice shaky. They're right. I've done this before. I let my prejudices affect my judgment. I've done it for years, and nobody ever really stopped me. The admission stunned the room into silence. Sarah looked at him thoughtfully. That's the first honest thing you've said today, Captain Werner. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat. Captain Werner, consider your employment with this airline terminated, effective immediately. We'll cooperate fully with any investigation into your past conduct. But Marcus held up his hand. That's not enough. Firing 1 pilot doesn't solve the systemic problem. We want comprehensive changes. He pulled out a document from his briefcase. Here's our proposal. Mandatory anti-discrimination training for all airline staff, transparent reporting of all discrimination complaints, and an independent review board to handle these cases. Plus, we want the airline to fund a scholarship program for minority students interested in aviation careers. The executives huddled together, whispering urgently. Meanwhile, Sarah turned to Werner. Captain Werner, I'm a doctor. I believe in healing. What happened today is a symptom of a bigger problem. Your honesty just now suggests you might be part of the solution. Would you be willing to share your story as part of these training programs, to help other people recognize and overcome their prejudices? Werner looked up, surprised by the offer of redemption. You want me to do that? After what I did? Sometimes, Marcus added, the most powerful teaching tools come from people who've recognized their mistakes and want to do better. Mr. Hayes returned to his seat. We accept your proposals, all of them, and Dr. Thompson, your suggestion about Captain Werner's participation in the training program is excellent, if he's willing. Werner nodded slowly. I am. It's time to make things right. As Sarah and Marcus left the office that afternoon, they knew this was more than just a victory over 1 incident of discrimination. It was the beginning of real change. Their delayed flight to Chicago had cost them a few hours. The impact of this day would last for years to come. 3 days after the incident at Atlanta International Airport, Sarah and Marcus Thompson sat in their hotel room in Chicago, watching the story unfold on national news. The viral video had reached over 10 million views, and their inbox was flooded with messages from people sharing similar experiences. And in breaking news, the CNN anchor announced, the Federal Aviation Administration has launched a formal investigation into discriminatory practices in the airline industry, following the incident involving Dr. Sarah Thompson and Captain James Werner. Sarah turned down the volume and looked at her husband. "This is bigger than we expected, Marcus." Marcus nodded, his laptop open to hundreds of unread emails. "Listen to this one. Dear Dr. Thompson, I'm a young black girl who dreams of becoming a pilot. Seeing you stand up to discrimination gives me hope. There are thousands like this." A knock on their hotel room door interrupted them. It was Patricia Chen, who had flown to Chicago specifically to meet with them. She carried a thick folder and looked both tired and determined. "Dr. Thompson, Colonel Thompson," she said as they invited her in, "I have something important to share with you." She spread several documents on the coffee table. "We've been doing a deep dive into our records. The problem is, well, it's worse than we thought." The documents revealed a pattern of discriminatory incidents across multiple airlines, most of them never properly addressed. Statistics showed that passengers of color were 3 times more likely to be questioned about their seating assignments or asked for additional documentation. "This is just the tip of the iceberg," Marcus said, reviewing the papers. "But it's exactly what we need to push for industry-wide reform." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jenny, the gate agent from Atlanta. "Captain Werner just finished his first interview with the diversity training team," she read aloud. "She says he's being surprisingly open about his past behavior and helping identify problematic procedures we never noticed before." Patricia nodded. "He's actually becoming one of our strongest advocates for change. Sometimes it takes someone from inside the problem to help solve it." Suddenly, Marcus's phone rang. It was the office of the Secretary of Transportation. "Colonel Thompson speaking," he answered, putting the call on speaker. "Yes, sir. Yes, we would be honored to testify. Next Tuesday, we'll be there." After ending the call, Marcus turned to Sarah and Patricia. "They're holding congressional hearings on discrimination in air travel. They want us to testify." Patricia stood up straighter. "Our CEO wants to testify too. Not to defend our past actions, but to publicly commit to the changes we're implementing. We want other airlines to follow suit." Sarah walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. "You know what surprises me most? How many people were ready for this change? They just needed a catalyst." Just then, another news alert flashed on the television. A group of major airlines had jointly announced the formation of a new industry task force on equality and inclusion. The task force would include civil rights leaders, aviation experts, and, most surprisingly, James Werner. "They're calling it the Thompson Initiative," Patricia said with a small smile. "Named after you both." Marcus joined his wife at the window. "When I stepped in at that gate, I just wanted to protect my wife. I never imagined it would lead to all this." Sarah squeezed his hand. "That's how change happens. One person stands up and another and another. Soon you have a movement." Patricia cleared her throat. "There's one more thing. The airline's board has approved the scholarship program. We're calling it the Sarah Thompson Future in Flight Scholarship. It will provide full funding for 5 minority students each year to attend aviation school." Sarah turned away from the window, tears in her eyes. Now that's real change. As Patricia left their hotel room that evening, Sarah and Marcus sat down to prepare their congressional testimony. They knew the coming weeks would be busy, between Sarah's medical practice, Marcus's military duties, and their new role as advocates for change in the airline industry. "You know," Sarah said, looking up from her notes, "Captain Werner's discrimination that day was terrible, but maybe we needed someone to be that openly biased, to finally force everyone to acknowledge the problem." Marcus nodded. "Sometimes it takes seeing something clearly to finally change it." Outside their window, planes took off and landed at Chicago O'Hare Airport, their lights twinkling in the evening sky. Each one carried hundreds of passengers, people of all races and backgrounds, who would soon be flying in an industry that was finally beginning to change. The congressional hearing room buzzed with anticipation. Cameras flashed as Sarah and Marcus Thompson took their seats at the testimony table. Behind them, rows of airline executives, civil rights leaders, and concerned citizens filled every available space. Senator Gloria Martinez, the committee chairwoman, called the hearing to order. "Today, we examine discrimination in the airline industry, sparked by recent events involving Dr. Sarah Thompson and Captain James Werner. Dr. Thompson, please begin your testimony. Sarah leaned toward the microphone, her voice steady and clear. Distinguished members of Congress, my story is not unique. What makes it different is that it was caught on camera, and I had the support to fight back. Many others face similar discrimination silently. As she spoke, the large screens in the hearing room displayed statistics gathered over the past week. Thousands of documented cases of discrimination, countless complaints buried in airline records, and patterns of biased treatment that could no longer be ignored. Marcus presented next, his military bearing commanding attention. This isn't just about one incident or one airline. This is about changing an industry that has allowed discrimination to flourish in the shadows. From the back of the room, James Werner watched intently. In the 2 weeks since the incident, he had become an unexpected ally in the fight for change. Today, he would face his own moment of truth before Congress. Captain Werner, Senator Martinez called. Please take the stand. Werner walked to the testimony table, looking different from the arrogant pilot who had confronted Sarah at Gate A7. His shoulders carried the weight of his past actions, but his steps were purposeful. Members of Congress, he began, his voice shaking slightly, I come before you not to defend my actions, but to expose the culture that enabled them. For 15 years, I discriminated against passengers of color. I was never seriously challenged because the system protected me. A murmur ran through the room. Werner continued, I'm here to tell you how pilots like me got away with it, so you can stop others from doing the same. For the next hour, Werner detailed the unwritten practices, the coded language, and the supple signals used to discriminate without leaving evidence. His testimony was devastating and eye-opening. During a break in the proceedings, Sarah approached Werner in the hallway. It was their first face-to-face meeting since Atlanta. Thank you, she said simply. Your honesty today will help a lot of people. Werner nodded, unable to meet her eyes. I keep thinking about my daughter. She's studying medicine, like you. I never wanted her to face discrimination, yet I was doing it to others every day. Back in the hearing room, airline CEOs presented their new policies. The Thompson Initiative was becoming industry standard. Transparent complaint systems, mandatory training, and scholarship programs for minority aviation students. But the most powerful moment came when Patricia Chen presented the early results of their changes. In just 2 weeks, she reported, our new reporting system has identified and addressed more discrimination cases than in the entire previous year. The problem wasn't that discrimination was rare, it was that we weren't really looking for it. As the hearing concluded, Senator Martinez made an unprecedented announcement. Based on today's testimony, this committee will draft the Air Travel Equality Act, requiring all airlines to implement anti-discrimination measures similar to the Thompson Initiative. Outside the Capitol building, reporters surrounded Sarah and Marcus. But Sarah was focused on a group of young black and brown children wearing pilot caps and holding signs that read, Future Pilots for Equality. Dr. Thompson, one little girl called out, I want to be a pilot and a doctor like you. Sarah knelt down to the girl's level. You can be anything you want to be, sweetheart. And hopefully, by the time you're ready to fly, no one will question whether you belong in the cockpit. Later that evening, in their hotel room, Sarah and Marcus watched as every major news network covered the hearing. Their phones buzzed constantly with messages of support and thanks. You know what this means? Marcus said, showing Sarah his phone. 3 other industries have reached out. They want to implement similar programs before they have their own Werner incident. Sarah smiled tiredly. Sometimes change needs a face. I just never expected it to be ours. As they packed for their flight home the next day, Sarah found herself thinking about Captain Werner's daughter, the little girl who wanted to be a pilot, and countless others who would benefit from this moment. What had started as discrimination at an airport gate was transforming into a movement for change across the entire aviation industry and beyond. 6 weeks after the congressional hearing, Sarah and Marcus sat in a large conference room at Atlanta International Airport. The walls displayed colorful posters announcing the first official training session of the Thompson Initiative. 50 airline employees filled the seats, a mix of pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, and administrators. At the front of the room, James Werner adjusted his tie nervously. This would be his first time leading a training session. Sarah had insisted he be part of the training team, believing his personal journey from discriminator to advocate would make a powerful impact. "Good morning," Werner began, his voice stronger than he felt. "My name is James Werner, and until 2 months ago, I was part of the problem we're here to solve." The room fell silent. Everyone knew his story, it had been all over the news. But hearing him speak about it in person was different. "I'm going to tell you about the day I made the biggest mistake of my career, and how it opened my eyes to the prejudices I've been carrying for years." He glanced at Sarah, who gave him an encouraging nod. As Werner shared his story, Patricia Chen quietly entered the room with an unexpected guest, his daughter, Dr. Emily Werner, who had flown in from Boston to surprise him. She stood at the back, watching her father with tears in her eyes. "The hardest part," Werner continued, "was admitting to myself that I had become exactly what I never wanted my daughter to face in her medical career. Dr. Thompson didn't just expose my discrimination, she helped me see how to make it right." Sarah stepped forward to join him. Together, they demonstrated real scenarios airline staff might encounter, showing both problematic responses and proper handling. The training was interactive, with participants role-playing various situations. During the lunch break, Emily approached Sarah. "Dr. Thompson, I've wanted to meet you since this all happened. My father. He's different now. Better. Thank you for giving him a chance to change instead of just destroying him." Sarah smiled warmly. Sometimes the best teachers are those who've learned from their mistakes. Meanwhile, Marcus was in another room with airline executives, reviewing the first month's data from their new reporting system. The numbers were encouraging. Complaints were being addressed within 24 hours, and staff interventions had prevented several potential incidents. "Look at this," Marcus said, pointing to a graph. "Reports are actually going up, but that's good news. People feel safer speaking out now. They know they'll be heard." Back in the training room, Werner was showing a series of photographs. "These are all accomplished professionals who were questioned or harassed on flights I operated," he explained. "Doctors, lawyers, business leaders. I let my prejudices blind me to their humanity." One photo showed a black woman in judicial robes. "This federal judge wrote a complaint about how I treated her. It was handled internally, meaning nothing was done. Today, under the new system, I would have been suspended immediately and sent to mandatory training." Patricia Chen stood up to share the latest industry updates. 5 more airlines have adopted the Thompson Initiative standards. The Air Travel Equality Act is expected to pass next month. But most importantly, we're seeing real change in day-to-day operations. She displayed messages from passengers praising the new atmosphere on flights. One read, "For the first time in my travel life, I wasn't treated with suspicion when I took my first-class seat. Thank you, Dr. Thompson." As the training session ended, Sarah noticed an elderly black man sitting quietly in the corner. She recognized him as Robert Carter, one of the first black commercial pilots in the United States. "Mr. Carter," she said, approaching him, "I'm honored you came." He stood slowly, leaning on his cane. "I had to see it for myself. In my day, we just had to take the discrimination. Watching that white pilot stand up there and admit his wrongs, seeing all these changes, it's something I never thought I'd live to see." Later that evening, as Sarah and Marcus drove home, they passed a billboard for the airline industry's new campaign, "The Sky Belongs to Everyone." Below it was information about the Sarah Thompson Future in Flight Scholarship. "You know what makes me happiest?" Sarah said, pointing to the billboard. "It's not seeing my name up there. It's knowing that somewhere, a young person of color is looking at that and believing they really can fly." Marcus squeezed her hand. "And thanks to these changes, when they do fly, they'll be treated with the respect they deserve." 1 year to the day after the incident at Gate A7, Sarah and Marcus Thompson stood in the grand ballroom of the National Air and Space Museum. The occasion was the first anniversary celebration of the Thompson Initiative and the Air Travel Equality Act. The room was filled with faces that had become familiar over the past year. Patricia Chen, now the airline's chief diversity officer, James Werner, leading the industry's training programs, and dozens of students from the Future in Flight Scholarship program, including young Jasmine, who had just completed her first year of aviation training. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia announced to the gathered crowd, "we're here to celebrate not just a year of change, but the beginning of a new era in aviation." She unveiled a large screen showing the year's statistics. Discrimination complaints down by 85%, minority employment in aviation up by 40%, and over 200 companies across different industries adopting similar anti-discrimination programs. James Werner took the stage next, looking comfortable in his role as a champion for change. A year ago, I was the problem. Today, I'm part of the solution, and let me tell you, this side feels much better. The audience laughed warmly, a sign of how far things had come. His daughter Emily, now a successful surgeon, sat in the front row. Next to her was Robert Carter, the pioneering black pilot who had witnessed so much change over his lifetime. He held a special award in his hands, the first Robert Carter Legacy Award, which would be presented later that evening. Sarah watched from her seat as Marcus approached the podium. "When I stepped in to defend my wife that day," he began, "I never imagined we'd be here a year later. But that's how change works. One person speaks up, then another, until finally, the whole world has to listen." The highlight of the evening came when Jasmine, now 16, took the stage. She stood proud in her aviation school uniform, her pilot's cap tucked under her arm. "Last week," she announced, her voice clear and confident, "I flew a plane for the first time. My instructor was Captain Werner." She paused, looking at Werner with a smile, the same man who, a year ago, might have questioned my right to be in first class, taught me how to soar through the clouds. That's what real change looks like. The room erupted in applause. Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she watched this young girl, who represented everything they had fought for. Later in the evening, Robert Carter rose slowly to present his namesake award. "This award," he said, his voice strong despite his age, "goes to someone who not only fought discrimination but helped others change their hearts. Dr. Sarah Thompson, please come forward." Sarah accepted the award, a beautiful crystal sculpture of a rising sun. "This isn't just my victory," she said, looking around the room. "This belongs to every person who ever faced discrimination and dreamed of change. To every child who looked up at the sky and wondered if they belonged there. You do belong. You always did." As the evening drew to a close, Patricia shared one final announcement. The airline industry had unanimously voted to make the Thompson Initiative's training programs permanent and mandatory for all aviation personnel worldwide. Outside the museum, Sarah and Marcus stood on the steps, looking up at the stars. A plane flew overhead, its lights bright against the dark sky. "You know what's amazing?" Sarah said softly. "Somewhere up there, right now, someone is sitting in first class, and nobody is questioning whether they belong." Marcus squeezed her hand. "And somewhere, a young person of color is watching that plane and knowing they could be the one flying it." They turned to go back inside, where the celebration continued. Young aviation students chatted with experienced pilots, flight attendants shared stories of positive changes they'd witnessed, and industry leaders discussed expanding the initiative even further. In the corner, Werner sat with his daughter Emily, watching Jasmine practice her pilot's salute. "Dad," Emily said, "I'm proud of you." Werner smiled, tears in his eyes. "I'm just grateful I got the chance to change." As Sarah looked around the room one last time, she saw not just the end of her story, but the beginning of countless others. The incident at Gate the 7 had opened a door that could never be closed again. "Ready to go home?" Marcus asked. Sarah nodded, picking up her award. "Yes, but our work isn't finished. It's just beginning." They walked out into the night, knowing that tomorrow, thousands of planes would take off across the country, carrying passengers of all backgrounds, each one protected by the changes they had helped create. The sky truly belonged to everyone now. On a crisp autumn morning, 3 months after the first Thompson Initiative training session, Sarah stood in front of a mirror at her home, adjusting her blazer. Today marked a significant milestone, the official signing of the Air Travel Equality Act at the White House. "Ready?" Marcus called from downstairs. "The car's here." As they rode to the airport, Sarah scrolled through her phone, reading the latest industry reports. The changes were remarkable. Discrimination complaints had dropped by 60%, and the new transparent reporting system was being praised as a model for other industries. At the airport, they noticed something different immediately. The walls displayed new posters showing diverse faces of airline staff and passengers. At security checkpoints, clear signs stated, Report any discrimination. Your voice matters. Patricia Chen met them at the gate. Dr. Thompson, Colonel Thompson, wait until you see this. She led them to a newly installed kiosk where passengers could instantly report any concerns. We've put these in every terminal across the country. Their flight to Washington, D.C. was special. It was Captain Werner's first time back in the cockpit since the incident, but now as a reformed man and certified diversity trainer. He had spent months working to earn back his pilot's license, completing extensive training and psychological evaluations. Good morning, passengers. Werner's voice came over the intercom, steady and humble. Today is my first flight since learning some very important lessons about prejudice and discrimination. I'm honored to have Dr. Sarah Thompson on board, whose courage helped me become a better person and a better pilot. During the flight, Sarah walked to the front of the plane to check on Werner. She found him during a quiet moment, looking thoughtful. Having any flashbacks? She asked gently. Werner nodded. Every time I look out at the passengers, I remember how wrong I was, how many people I hurt with my prejudices. The past can't be changed, Sarah replied, but you're helping change the future. In Washington, the White House ceremony was packed with aviation industry leaders, civil rights activists, and government officials. The president stood at the podium, holding up the Air Travel Equality Act. This law, the president declared, ensures that no American will face discrimination in air travel again, and we owe this change to the courage of Dr. Sarah Thompson, the honesty of Captain James Werner, and the dedication of everyone involved in the Thompson Initiative. After the signing, Sarah was surprised to see a group of familiar faces, the young children who had attended the congressional hearing, still wearing their pilot caps. They had been invited specially for this occasion. One little girl, Jasmine, now wore a proper pilot's uniform, made just for her. Dr. Thompson, she called out excitedly. I got accepted into the Future in Flight program. In 10 years, I'm going to be a pilot. Sarah hugged her tightly. And you won't have to fight for respect like we did. During the reception, airline CEOs approached Marcus with news. The Thompson Initiative was being adapted for hotels, restaurants, and other service industries. What had started as one incident of discrimination was transforming into a national movement for change. Robert Carter, the elderly former pilot, was there too. This time, he wasn't sitting quietly in the corner. He was surrounded by young aviation students, sharing stories of his pioneering days. Things are different now, he told them, gesturing toward Sarah and Werner, who were talking nearby. When people admit their mistakes and work to fix them, real change happens. Later that evening, at their hotel, Sarah and Marcus watched the news coverage of the signing. But Sarah's attention was drawn to an email from a young black medical student. She says seeing my story gave her the courage to report discrimination at her hospital, Sarah told Marcus. They're now implementing changes based on our airline industry model. Marcus smiled. Remember when we thought this was just about one pilot and one flight? Sarah looked out the window at the planes taking off and landing at Reagan National Airport, their lights twinkling in the darkness. Each one carried people of all backgrounds, now protected by law from the discrimination she had faced. Sometimes, she said softly, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. We just have to be brave enough to stand up when those moments come. As they prepared for bed, Sarah's phone buzzed with one last message, a photo from Captain Werner. It showed him in his cockpit, with his daughter Emily beside him, both smiling. The caption read, "Teaching the next generation to do better. Thank you for showing us the way."